Good evening and welcome, everyone. Instead of going through all the introductions, we'll just jump into the open discussion. Since Jamie's the affirmative, he'll start. But before we hand it off to Jamie, history, different timer.
Yeah, thanks. To the subject at hand. And so that's not an issue about a defense of a particular denominational position. I would argue, though, that my position is by far and away, if not exclusively, the Protestant Reformation view. John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Knox, Matthew Henry, Charles Spurgeon. I mean, just go down the list. In fact, I would argue that this idea, although bits and pieces have been considered through church history, different aspects of it that may be regarded to my opponent's position have been considered. But I would argue those being in error were mainly regarded to the confusion over similar language in other chapters of Daniel. But the one thing we all agree on is that Daniel 9 is certainly about the timing and coming of Jesus, the Messiah. And one of the key elements of that is, and here, thus is the debate, mainly centered around verse 27. Who is the he of verse 27? Who confirms a covenant, and when is that? When did that occur, or when should it occur, and why? Okay, so I want to point out. So I'm going to go through kind of some key features over my main argument, and that would start with the beginning verse. Or one of the major questions would be: are we justified in putting time gaps anywhere in the timeline? So I want to know here. This is Daniel. They're in captivity in Babylon, and Daniel's recognizing that the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah are coming to an end under the king Nebuchadnezzar, probably the 68th year or something like that, although there's different ways of understanding it. But what's mainly agreed upon is he's praying because he knows God has promises and that he wants the city to be restored. So he's praying, and then Gabriel comes to him and gives him this prophecy regarding the restoration of the people of God. Which is, circles around the temple and the land God has provided for them. And so we're told from the very start, 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city. And here's a key factor I think my opponent's view has failed to make clear. This is very key. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince. This is the verse that tells us what to watch for when the clock starts and how to recognize the timing and coming of Messiah. So there's a decree that has to go forth, and the clock is started. And we're told that from the going forth of the commandment to restore unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, that's 69 weeks, because 62 weeks is 62. So we should be watching for a decree given from a king, and there's 4 possibilities in the Bible that's recorded from Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes has 2 different decrees recorded. Now my contention is, or my suggestion would be that there's only one decree that fits the timeline. And now let me go through this a little bit more. One other point I want to make about this. So we're told then in verse 26, so that gives us the timing in verse 25 from a decree that we need to know and we need to understand, because from that decree until 69 weeks, 7 and 62 of the 70 weeks in verse 24, with the Messiah would show up. Okay. So we need to know and understand it and have a decree in mind. And we have 4 to choose from in scripture, and we'll come back to that. Okay. So that would be key. That would be one of the first factors that I would challenge my opponent to have worked out, because they did recognize the time of his coming at the time he was anointed and declared the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world at his baptism. Okay, point number 2, that's very key, that I think many of those in the futurist camp don't have worked out very well. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off. What does this verse actually say, and what does it not say? It says that we know there's 7 weeks and then 62. Sometime after the 62, he's going to die. That's all we know. We don't know if he died. We just know sometime after, and it's very clear in the Hebrew. It's not during, it's not at the end of. The Messiah is cut off sometime after the 62 weeks have passed, after the 62, which is after the 7. Notice, yes, after 62 weeks, he'll be cut off. That's all it says. It doesn't give us any timing. It certainly doesn't say and during or at the end of the 62, which is really the 69th week, which is mostly agreed upon by the commentators and interpreters. So let's go to the other slide, please. Thank you. So let me zoom in on that. So the challenge would be, do you have a decree and can you make the timeline work? So here's a comparative chart between the futurist camp and the historicist camp. And the answer is absolutely not. They do not. And they don't care because they got to make that 70th week about the Antichrist, which is absolutely false and for sure not true. And they can't make a decree work with the timing of the Messiah's ministry. And so right out the gate, they failed and they've abandoned the Protestant truth. And here, let me note these, the potential decrees in Scripture. There's the first decree of Cyrus and the second decree of Darius. And there's the corresponding. I'm going to not go into great detail on this just for the sake of time. My contention is there's only one decree that fits. And that's this third one here, the decree of Artaxerxes. And what do you know? If you count time according to how the Jews actually counted years, from this decree, 457 BC, you land, and then here's the two charts. Okay, this is and this is where it gets critical, and their view is debunked. And I mean that like sincerely. The way they do it, there's another decree of Artaxerxes in his 20th year instead of the 7th year. So it starts later in history. And then they shrink the years by making them 360 days long, which is not appropriate, which I'll explain in a minute. Because they can't make it work from the decree that's actually the right decree, right? Because that would just be that would be too much like the right view, which would then everything fits. See, so when they take it to the next decree, and then they make the years shorter, and they do all these fancy conversions that don't make any sense and can't work, although they've tried very desperately, starting with Anderson. And they have to like modify, well, how long is an actual year? And then so it's so many years. And then they turn the years into days and they make it a 360 day, making it literally, which doesn't work. And here's why it doesn't work for certain. For certain. Because from year to year, which is what this prophecy was originally for, so that the Jews would recognize the timing from the decree, it was given to them as a prophecy, right? We know how to align the years with like Babylon and other calendars historically, archaeology, right? You know, the scholars. There's annual feasts. That it means there's one per Jewish year. Well, guess what? There wasn't one Passover every 360 days. We know that for a fact. It's a fact. So this isn't spectacle. This isn't speculation. This isn't me proposing a theory. We know how they counted years, and they counted years by what I've described in other videos. And so in their attempts, which fail, by the way, which every attempt has failed, dating back from the 1800s, to jiggle the years by making them X amount of days per year. No, there was one Passover in the spring every year. If you have a 360-day year, it does not and cannot work and is not the way they counted years. So there's only one decree that works, and it works perfectly. And that's Artaxerxes' 7th year. And they will not face this. Anybody who says that he is not Jesus, which makes Jesus fail the prophecy, and robs him of the greatest verse in the entire Bible, they've tried to make it work and they can't. And we know factually how the calendar works. And when you take it how the calendar works, Artaxerxes' 7th year, 457, lands exactly on Jesus' ministry beginning in 27 AD. And many other people don't want to face this also because they want to put Jesus' death in 33 AD, which is also false because it does not align with the sabbatical cycles, which Jesus' death in 31 AD is bam, right in the middle of the sabbatical. They still operate on these sabbatical cycles today if you do the math, like going forward from Jesus' death. which is 457 is one of those years. So no, they didn't have one Passover per year every 360 days. See, in this debate, he didn't even try to make a timeline, which means the foundation of his theory is false for other reasons too. Okay. This isn't an Adventist view. This is Protestant view. Jesus confirms the covenant. Well, I'll get there when we get there. But again, their view forces Jesus' death outside of the 70 weeks, which means he didn't make reconciliation for iniquity in the 70 weeks, which is dead out of the gate. Then some people will try to put it at the end of the 69th week, which doesn't work, because verse 25 is telling you when his ministry begins, and it's only 3.5 years later, in the midst of the 70th week, his ministry begins the 70th week, and his death marks the center of it. And it's his death that ratifies the covenant, meaning it inaugurates the new covenant by his death, because and that's what Paul's talking about, the death of the testator, etc. It is his death on the cross, the blood of the covenant. That's how he confirms the covenant. He comes preaching the gospel of the kingdom. His teaching continues on to this day, but what ratifies the covenant in order to fulfill the prophecy of bringing the new covenant is his death. The New Testament couldn't be clearer. In fact, that's its purpose. It is the purpose of the New Testament to display this. It's only misplaced conceptions of confirming a covenant for a week, which people have been brainwashed about, the Antichrist is going to confirm this covenant that lasts so long. No. Christ's death confirms the covenant. Him being cut off confirms the new covenant, which is a ratification of the old covenant, which is what it means for him to be the Messiah that's promised. That's what the New Testament demands, in fact. So there's really no debate except for the misconceptions of false ideas emanating from crazy ways of looking at this that people brought up through dispensational concepts. Hebrew grammar demands that the he is Jesus, the one who's in view in the immediate context, because that's what we're talking about in Daniel 9. The he being Titus, which isn't even identified as the Antichrist in this text, and will make no sense to the first century audience who's reading this, understanding that Jesus is the fulfillment as the Messiah before the temple's even been destroyed. So none of that would make any sense to the first century audience and the first century writers of the text who are still living under the time when the temple stands. So none of that would make sense when they're talking about it and relating these texts to what has happened and who Jesus is. None of that makes sense. It's impossible. It's anachronistic. It's demonstrable. Green is the broken up of the 7 weeks and the 62, and he dies after the 62. Okay. The problem with the futurist view is that if Jesus dies after the 62 and the 70th hasn't started yet, the problem we have is this. Jesus dies in the time period that's not a part of the appointed 70 weeks to bring in everlasting righteousness, to make an end of sin, and to make atonement for iniquity. 70 weeks have been allotted to fulfill and accomplish those things. Let's see if I have the verses here to try to emphasize this. I guess I don't. My view has it from 457, and if you count 7 weeks and 62 weeks, the city being restored in the first 7, that's maybe why the increment is broken up. We can see that 49 years would be a jubilee, and that the prophecy is entirely based on jubilees. It's 10 jubilees long, and the Jews, in fact, still keep jubilees according to this reckoning, starting in 457, and every 7 years and every 7 years we have a jubilee. They still are. And again, the years counted to make a jubilee or to make a sabbatical cycle, the years that make up a sabbatical cycle are not 360 days long. They have an intricate calendar which kept the Passover in the spring because they're annual feasts. They're not feasts every 360 days, which, again, if you understand what that means, which I've described in other videos, it falsifies any attempt to make any other timeline. If you believe the Bible's accurate and it indeed did predict Jesus coming, which it did perfectly, according to the way we know they kept their calendar. There is only one way. And the reason the 7th year of Artaxerxes is the right decree, even though there were decrees from previous kings to rebuild Jerusalem, which they began to do. When God says it's a restoration and a rebuilding, what would a restoration look like? It would look like the Torah being implemented from the temple by judges of the appropriate tribe over the entire land, including executing the death penalty under Torah's rules. That's a restoration. They did not have that until the Artaxerxes 7th year, which demands that the appointed judges going back to the land, a true restoration of Jerusalem. Anything else is just a building project. Just like Jesus putting an end to the sacrifices is true if you believe Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. That is the sacrifice that takes away sins. The fact that men who didn't accept Christ as their sacrifice continued to kill animals in some building for 40 years that God didn't accept isn't putting an end to the sacrifices. You don't get what it means to restore Jerusalem. You don't get what it means in the purpose of the sacrifices, which were no longer being applicable to redeem them of their sins, because they're not doing by faith what God has set out to do. And that was all pointing to the death of Jesus. So yeah, McDonald's kills animals in a building. My uncle has barbecues every year. It doesn't take away their sins. Jesus put an end to sacrifices because he took away the sins of the world by his death, rendering animal sacrifices for sins irrelevant. Are based on that cycle system from the restoration of the temple and from 457, from that dating. But when you count the 69, which is 483 years, okay, hopefully people are familiar with how you reckon the weeks of years, but it just so happens that Jesus' baptism in 27 AD falls exactly. And what did it tell us? That after after 7 and 62, Messiah will come. Well, exactly that long from that decree, counting years properly, how we know they did historically, Jesus is baptized and anointed and calls his disciples. And exactly 3.5 years, Jesus is killed, which I would argue, and I doubt I'll get any confrontation on this, it is by the death of Jesus that the new covenant comes to be, that he ratifies the old covenant, brings in everlasting righteousness by his death and resurrection, and puts an end to animal sacrifices. So my opponent will go on to say, Jesus didn't bring in everlasting righteousness. Jesus didn't put an end to sins. Well, what do you mean? He's the kinsman redeemer. People are saved through the merits that he accomplishes as a sinless sacrifice. So yes, Jesus demonstrated a perfect human life. That's the theology of this, by not sinning and being an appropriate sacrifice, according to the idea. He demonstrated as a human perfect righteousness. So I really find it really interesting when people try to argue that, oh, Jesus didn't bring in everlasting. Well, if you mean it's not fully realized in his saints, well, yeah, that's why he's doing a work in the heavenly sanctuary, which the book of Hebrews demonstrates. And so I always find it funny when these people criticize Adventists for saying Jesus didn't finish it, when the New Testament teaches that Jesus is continuing his work as high priest in a heavenly sanctuary. And Adventists defend the idea that the sacrifice that Jesus did indeed take away the sins of the world. Okay. And that's being worked out in the saints into his second coming. And then these same people turn around and then apply Daniel 9:27 to the Antichrist, robbing Christ of the greatest verse in the Bible, proving who he is and what he accomplished. And then they turn around when we're defending that, saying, no, Jesus did accomplish this as the kinsman redeemer. Jesus did demonstrate perfect obedience and merited our justification before God and did away with animal sacrifices for sins, which the blood of bulls and goats could never deal with permanently, clearing the conscience, as Hebrews says. So then they turn around and say Adventists don't believe in the atonement, but then these people believe Jesus didn't. Basically, they robbed Jesus of the proof, and then they say that verse, Jesus died outside of the 70 weeks in this imaginary gap between the 69th and the 70th week, which is not suggested in the text whatsoever. Essentially, some of them going so far dispensationally that they'll say Jesus didn't even bring in the new covenant.
It's outrageous. It's the most thick irony you could imagine. So
this fits only one decree, and now I would argue that many futurists and dispensationalists, since that idea of a future 70th week has been developed theologically, they had tried to make from a decree and rendering of time work, and so far none have been able to succeed in making that work, even when employing time periods like a 360-day year and messing with it all sorts of different ways in that regard have failed to make the prophecy fit. I would also point out that a very prominent scholar named, oh, it slips my mind. I should have had this written down. Well, I'll just put it this way. It's recognized that this decree is the only one that works properly rendering the time and counting of years. There's only one decree, and that is 457. And so regarding the he of Daniel 9:27, I guess I could go into that, but hopefully people are just familiar with this contention. The immediate context, if you want to put the verse back up that you had, we can just go off of that probably, if you don't mind. How much time do I have?
You got a little bit over 2 minutes.
Oh yeah, here, I'll just go to mine. So verse 27, how many minutes? 2?
Yeah.
Okay. He shall, so here's the contention. I'll kind of lay it out so Merritt doesn't have to. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. I would suspect that we understand that Jesus confirmed the new covenant by his death. I don't think that's under contention. So the question is, who is the he? He shall confirm the covenant. Some will say that it's the prince of the people that shall come in verse 26. I would argue that the immediate context of this prophecy is to fulfill the 6 things from verse 24. And these 6 things, I think, are universally understood to be what Jesus accomplishes. So this is about restoration of God's people and ultimately calling back all people of the whole world, all nations. And that's Jesus' work. So the immediate context calls for the understanding of this, the he being Jesus, the Messiah, which everybody agrees is in view and the subject of the prophecy through verse 26. I would also point out that usually the King James is quite careful about its grammar, and the technical proper grammar would suggest that the antecedent doesn't really fit with the prince from the people of the prince, because the subject of the sentence, the people of the prince, is the people, which is a plural and would not afford a singular pronoun to be have it as a pronoun in verse 27. The only singular male person in context in the prior to be a candidate for the antecedent would be that which is the immediate context of the prophecy, who is the Messiah, the prince. So the he, if the pronoun in verse 27 meant to point to the subject of the prior mention of a subject, it would be a plural. It'd be the people. Of the prince that shall come is kind of what you might call an adjectival descriptor. And so
go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay, so I would just argue that the he, it's not proper grammar to refer to an adjectival clause or whatever, which is just a describing which people, the people of a prince. The subject is the people, so the he belongs with the subject in the immediate context, which is the Messiah. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jamie, for your opening. In other words, they try to make this the Antichrist, which there's no Antichrist in this immediate context. They get there by like a totally foreign context that they're reading into it by their own theology. In other words, well, the people of the prince is the Romans, because the Romans, we know historically, are going and destroying the city, Titus being the general of the Roman armies that destroyed Jerusalem. They're not recognizing the parallelism of verse 26 and 27 being about Messiah in 26 and 27a, and then 26 and 27b, the latter halves of those, talking about the ultimate outcome of what's going on with the Messiah, which is what's happening in the 70 weeks. In other words, and so the antecedent to the he, they want to say, is the prince, and then make this about the Antichrist in a future covenant, the 70 week being cast off into the future. We're still waiting for it, in fact, right? Well, the he, pronouns have a referent or a antecedent in context. Well, that's usually referring to the subject. Well, the subject in the prior sentence, 26b, is the people. What people? The people with red hair, the people with fat stomachs, the people with brown shoes. Of the prince is which people is a descriptor of that subsubject of the prior verse. So if it's referring to you usually use in proper grammar, the antecedent would be the subject or the noun, right? The noun of the prince is not the noun there. It's not the subject noun. It's the people, but that's a plural. Who destroys the city? The people, plural, of a prince, of brown shoes, of freckles. So you don't, that's not proper grammar. And obviously the beginning of every verse, which the subject is the Messiah, all thoroughly through there. This is good news, by the way, also, which is what this is the answer to Daniel's prayer, and comes as good news. Leaving you hanging about the death of the Messiah, and then casting this verse, which is about the Antichrist making a false covenant with the people of God in some far-flung future imagined thing, is absolutely absurd. It would make no sense to the original audience, either when this was written, when this is fulfilled, or in the New Testament, which is confirming that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the purpose of the text. So, and then to say it's about the Antichrist when the text doesn't even speak about an Antichrist, it only alludes to what we know, looking back on it, is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and Mark 13. It's so far flung from the context, it makes absolutely no sense. Even in its fulfillment in the New Testament, they wouldn't have got what that meant, because the temple still wasn't destroyed when the New Testament was written, fulfilling these prophecies, demonstrating that Jesus is the Messiah. It's absolutely absurd. It's obsessive and should be discarded immediately and thrown into the trash and burned. In fact, hell may exist. An ever-burning hell might exist, but only to discard this doctrine into it, and the doctrine of eternal conscious torment along with it. So there may indeed be an eternal hell, but it's for these doctrines only.